The topic for today's episode is the importance of working beyond retirement. My guest today is fellow retirement coach Gary Allen Foster. In addition to being a retirement coach, Gary is also an executive recruiter and a career transition coach. Gary resides in the Denver area. The reason I was excited to have Gary on the episode today is Gary is somebody who's continued to work beyond retirement, and he's really thought a lot about this and has experience in the importance of working beyond retirement. So I'm excited to get Gary's thoughts. Gary, welcome to the episode today.
Well, thanks, Reed. It's good to be here. Good to see you again. Look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such an important topic, Gary. And I think it's becoming more important because of the topic of longevity you and I have talked about before. Mm-hmm. Of course, people are living longer, they're living healthier, they're more active. There's a lot more baby boomers that are transitioning into retirement or what is called retirement. And so I think this topic is really important for a lot of people who are reaching that stage in their lives and want to think about how they're going to spend that time. So the first thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is there seems to be a changing view of retirement, I think, currently happening. And I wanted to get your thoughts on why people are starting to change their view of retirement.
Well, there's a lot of spots where we can jump into that. I think you touched on one of them when you mentioned just simply the fact that we've got the boomers moving through this phase now, and you being one. I'm a pre-boomer by 4 years, but I really think of myself as a boomer. Fundamentally, I mean, the boomers have driven a lot of change as they've gone through their lives. So I think this is just another one of them. But I think, behind it also is the fact that there's this growing realization that this really, what we've held on to as retirement, this traditional retirement concept is frankly just kind of an archaic, irrelevant model. I mean, it goes back. We can really kind of tag it back to the 1935 when they established the retirement age of 65, which was a political decision anyhow. I mean, the average lifespan back then was 62. So
yeah,
it didn't make a lot of sense, and we're still carrying that forward. But I think that a lot of people now, and it's amazing to me how entrenched this whole idea of retirement is in the minds of most people. But I think we're seeing a change now where people saying, hey, I'm not so sure this makes a lot of sense. Certainly there's, age 65 is just a number. I mean, it's arbitrary, and it doesn't mean we're done. At 65, I certainly didn't feel that way. So I think that's part of it. And certainly you touched on another one. I mean, longevity, people are realizing, hey, 30 years of, bocce ball and bingo, ain't going to make a lot of sense for me. So, and I think, the boomers have pioneered a lot of things, and they're saying, I'm worth more than just hanging out. I mean, I've contributed a lot. I want to continue to contribute. So I think there's kind of a sense of this looking at their own worthiness, and I think that's beginning to shed a new light on what is considered the retirement age. I like to refer to it really kind of the third stage or the third act of life, which is that. It's that space between middle age, which is really the end of parenting or end of career, to true old age where we're incapable of doing anything. So that's, people are looking at that and say, wow, that's now 20, 25, 30, maybe 40 years. I could probably get a lot done during that time. So I think of it just like, people are just backing up and say, hey, I'm not done yet. I think there's a lot of things that I can still do. And a lot of them, I think in the past, you and I've kind of talked about this whole thing of balance. I think people see it as an opportunity, especially if they're financially prepared, which is a whole nother discussion topic maybe we can touch on. If they're financially prepared, it's an opportunity for them to put together a balance of leisure and work, and perhaps even continuing to learn. And I think that's a growing trend too in this third act of doing those three things to kind of balance life: work, learning, and leisure, mix them all together, and helps keep you productive. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's part of what I feel is impact in the new attitude.
Yeah, and I think it's a good time too for people to explore different passions. And it could be something either in their career area or outside of their career area that they could continue to work not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be in your career field that you've worked in for the past 40 years. It could be, again, like you said, especially for people who are financially prepared, it could be doing something that they're really passionate about, but perhaps doesn't bring in the same amount of income. But it brings a lot more joy and meaning and purpose to their lives.
Well, I think that's a great point. You know, if there's sometimes there's this tendency to think of either or, when in fact, when you move into this phase of life, it can be both and. In other words, maybe through your work career of 30 or 40 years or whatever that may be, maybe you weren't right at the heart of your passion or your purpose, but you developed skills, you developed talents, and paid the bills along the way, right?
Yeah.
But maybe deep inside, you've got something that you kind of really wanted to get back to. Maybe it's a deeper passion. Maybe it's what you like to do when you're 6 or 10, you know, like that sort of thing. So why not bring that forward, combine that with the skills and talents that you've acquired through your career, and then turn that into, I like the concept of a lifelong lifestyle business. I mean,
right.
People doing that. So a lot of options, but I think that so much of it just really gets around to the fact that, hey, we really need to rethink this whole arbitrary artificial finish line of 65 and what that means, because my fear and part of my quest, as you well know, is to try to help people or help convince people that, we're wasting a lot of resources here. We ought to just turn those back and redeploy what we're good at, keep going,
right,
balance life, and continue to contribute to society. So.
Yeah, and you see that a lot too when people do leave their careers that they do want to keep working at. A lot of times, whether they're let go from their company because of age or whether it's because of health issues, there is a lot of knowledge in companies that is walking out the door that could be repurposed or continue to be used.
But I don't think we can ignore the fact that there have been some economic events over the last 2 or 3 decades, which have influenced a lot of viewpoints on retirement. For one, we've seen the elimination of pensions, for example, which has really kind of thrust people onto the mercy of the stock market. I think I've gone through 7 different major corrections in the stock market in my investing career. So, and I share with you, I saw an alarming statistic. I guess it's not terribly alarming because I've kind of heard numbers like this before, but there was a Market Watch article that came out last week that said over half of Americans have 0 in retirement savings.
Wow.
And only 11% of the population have $500,000. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but if you got 30 years ahead of you, just do the math. The 500,000 isn't going to carry very far when you consider, because the other part of the statistics here was the fact that couples over 65, they live to an average lifespan, are going to face at least that much, $400,000 to $500,000 in medical costs and long-term care costs. So those are pretty freaky numbers. And again, I think people are just saying, whoa, I'm not ready, I'm not prepared, so I'm going to have to do something. And there's a serendipitous effect of all that. When they realize that they got to continue to work, what often happens is that they get healthier, which is kind of an irony about the whole thing. Yeah.
Right. Let's take a look at the flip side of that. To me, Gary, is that I think there's still some resistance to retiring or continuing to work beyond a certain age. So people still have I guess they're resistant to working beyond a certain age. So they still have this view that I need to retire at this age. Why do you think there continues to be some resistance to continuing to work in retirement? And I think we've covered some of that, but.
Well, you kind of take me into one of my favorite areas right now, and that is, because I'm really kind of becoming a student of this, and that is the impact of cultural expectations. When I think about how our culture and some of frankly, I call them myths and models and messages that are really kind of erroneous. And I think we're kind of driven by this cultural expectation that you need to be checking out into retirement somewhere around 62. I think the average retirement age right now is 62. So there's kind of this cultural expectation, and you know, as humans, we're susceptible to comparison, and we're concerned about what others may think. So, you know, somehow we've kind of created this atmosphere where if you haven't decided to retire by 65, your retired neighbor is going to give you a bad time about it, right? It's like you're ostracized for wanting to continue to work and contribute. So I think that's a big part of the pressure, plus just simply the fact that it is so pounded on us. Yeah, let me give you an example. How many non-financial planner commercials are there during the Masters? Very few.
Right.
You know, if they aren't some major investment firm advertising on the Masters, it's going to be some drug company, right? All aimed at people in their later age, but it's all about retirement, and it's all about only the positives of retirement. So it's so driven into us just in our culture and in the media, it's hard to give it up.
Well,
that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes, that goes back to a previous comment you made too, that it's been so ingrained in our society for such a long time that the retirement age is this, and people don't start to look at there's a different option that's perfectly viable. And it could be completely for a non-financial reason or reasons. So
absolutely.
Yep. So, and that kind of leads me into then my next question that I wanted to pose to you, Gary, is why do you think work is, and particularly I think from your own experience and from your experience working as a career transition coach, and you've probably worked with people later on in their career transitions, is why is work important, particularly in retirement? And I know we've covered some of these, but if you could summarize maybe some of the primary reasons somebody should consider working beyond retirement, what would that list be?
Well, I think I have to start with the fact that a lot of people just have to. I mean, there's some people that, a lot of people are just going to have to continue to work.
Right.
The whole economic dynamic has changed. So, I mean, that's a given for, I think, a significant percentage of the population. But I also think another reason, I mean, there's really some compelling evidence that work is important. And I guess maybe the easiest thing I could reach to is if you just consider, take for example, if you're familiar, and some of the audience may be familiar with the concept of the blue zones. There was a book written by Dan Buettner where they found 5 countries in the world where the average age was much higher than most other parts of the world, and they had the largest percentage of centenarians. Well, there were 8 or 9 common factors across all 5 of those blue zones. Well, at the heart of it was that people didn't stop working. You know, work was something that they did right up to the end. And not only that, but they had what I call a shortened period of morbidity. In other words, they didn't have an extended illness before they died. An awful lot of the people, the centenarians, like went to bed, died in their sleep, you know, fully vital the day before. So, but they were always active, they were working, and typically that work involved a considerable amount of physical activity. So, and that's where I think we kind of get in a trap in our white collar information age economy, you know, where we sit in front of a tube like I do all day, and, you know, but I think that, so there's strong evidence, number one, that work is a part of remaining vital. And there've been a lot of studies. I remember the one was done by the Society of Actuaries. Who would have known there was such an organization? It was called the RP 2000 study. And I believe the essence of that was that people who retired early had more than twice the death rate of those who continued to work. And that was reinforced by a study that Shell Oil did. They did the same sort of study, and they found, I think it was they looked at retirees at 55, and they had double the risk for death before reaching 65 compared to those who work beyond 60. So I think there's a lot of compelling evidence in favor of continuing to work, and then kind of on the flip side was what I recall is there was a study by, I think IBM did a study. This goes back a generation or a generation and a half ago, and they looked at their pensioners, and they found that the average number of pension checks that were issued was 24. So people who fully retired on average were living like 2 years. Social Security study did in 1995 a similar study, and they found the average number of Social Security checks was 29. So a little beyond 2 years. So to me, it was evidence that those people that just kind of checked out and went to the lazy boy weren't sticking around as long. Whereas, another thing, Reed, and I'll share this with you because this goes all the way back to when I was in my 40s. Because I remember I started questioning the whole retirement concept.
Yep.
Back when I was in my 40s. And one of the things because I kind of got into the self-help deal back in, when I was this was in the 80s. And it was a time of Brian Tracy and, Tony Robbins was starting to emerge and Dennis Waitley and people like that. And one of the things that's always stuck in my mind, and I don't remember where I read it or heard it, was that when you looked at the people back then that were living the longest, they were people who stayed in the creative world. It was musicians and composers and artists and writers, people that didn't remove themselves from their work. And it can go all the way back to ancient Greece, where the average lifespan was like 28 or 30. And you look at some of the really big people from that era, and I can't name the names, but the Aristotles and those people like that, they were living into their 80s, sometimes into their 90s. So they were, 2 and 3 times the average length, but they always were in the creative process. So I think that we've got a lot of compelling background research and information that shows that if we continue to work in some capacity, it's going to do a lot for us from a physical health standpoint and from a mental health. I mean, again, we're looking at
and
Alzheimer's may even be affected by our willingness to continue to work. So
right. Sorry to interrupt, Gary. I was just going to jump in too and just say, just from the standpoint of mental challenge, we need to keep challenging ourselves in some capacity. And a lot of people, when they retire, and I think this goes back to if they would have, and I don't know in those studies if they dug into that, but I think a lot of it is simply when they stop working and you're not mentally challenged. There's a physical component and there's a mental component. And if you're not continuing to learn and be challenged and have something to look forward to from that I think that's really where I think the work can come in too, in retirement. We need that extra challenge. There's health benefits. The one thing that I don't think we've talked about is the social benefits too, because so many people, when they leave work, that is their main social circle, if you will, of people that they connect with. And when they leave that work, all of a sudden they don't have the social connections. And there's research, I think, around the importance of having those social connections too.
Well, it's pretty substantial, really. I mean, in fact, ARP even came out with an article that I found interesting that, and I don't remember exactly what their source was for this, but they said that social isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, for men in particular, typically when you move into retirement, one of the biggest challenges is replacing your identity, because we as men tend to tie our identity to our work. And you leave work and you got close relationships there, relationships you build over 10 or 15 or 20 years or whatever, and there's kind of the expectations that those relationships are going to continue. And it sounds a little harsh, but I kind of feel like that relationship started going into the tank about the time they swallowed the last piece of your retirement cake. You're out the door and they're into their own issues, and then you wonder why they're not responding when you call them to get together for lunch. So And it's a challenge for men, I think, in particular, to rebuild a social network. Women are better at it, let's face it. And typically when Papa comes home in retirement, she's already got her social network built. And
Yeah.
she doesn't necessarily want him horning in on it, if you will. So it's, yeah, I think isolation is, well, we know physically and mentally. You know, the other thing too is that, I mean, and I tell people this all the time. Look, you know that your muscles are going to atrophy if you don't use them. Well, your muscles, your brain's a muscle. So if you don't use it, and we now have incredible evidence that has turned part of neurology upside down. 20 years ago, we just accept the fact that our brain was going to shrink and we're going to lose mental capacity. Well, that's absolutely false. We now know that you and I, even at our age, can rebuild neural connections as effectively as someone 20 or 30 or 40 years younger. Now, we're gonna be a little bit slower connecting to it, but we can rebuild our neural connections and retain and build brain capacity as we get older. So, but we're not going to do, I love the study that was done. We've got this thing now called functional MRI, fMRI. That's where we can wire people up and we can read where the electrical activity is taking place in their brain.
Yeah.
And somebody did a study where they took two groups and they had one group stare at a brick wall and another one watch a sitcom. And they measured their brain activity in both of them. And guess what? They compared them. Which one do you think had the most brain activity? It was a wash.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So think about that the next time you watch a sitcom. You can stimulate your brain at the same level if you were watching or looking at a brick wall. So
yeah,
I think that story really resonates with me because there's so many things that we could be doing to stimulate our brain. TV isn't one of them. So I get off that soapbox.
Right. Well, this is a great topic, Gary, and I know it's one we could continue talking about much longer. And there's lots of different angles and different takes we could add to this, and I'm sure it's probably a topic we will dive into in a future episode. But thanks for joining me today, Gary, and looking forward to a next episode with you.
Well, I tell you what, I really appreciate what you're doing with this because it's a message that you and I obviously feel very strongly about it, that we need to just keep pounding this message that, hey, we ain't done yet. We got a lot we can accomplish. So I applaud what you're doing and hopefully be a part of it going forward.
Thanks, Gary. We'll talk again soon.
Great. Thanks, Reed.